Case 1. George Kimbangu. The smell of smoke drifted through the desert air long before anyone dared approach the ritual grounds. It was the late 1920s, and in a hidden stretch of California scrubland, the followers of a little-known cult leader gathered in trembling anticipation. Torches flickered as women in loose white gowns swayed and chanted, their voices cracked from hours of fasting. At the center of the formation stood a crude brick furnace that radiated an angry orange glow, the so-called miracle oven, a device their prophet claimed had been ordained by heaven itself. Tonight, a young woman was chosen to prove her faith. She stepped forward with shaking legs, eyes overflowing with a mixture of terror and devotion, convinced that divine power would shield her from the flames. Papa Doc, the shadowy figure who presided over this gathering, raised his hands and assured the crowd that she would emerge untouched, purified, anointed, transformed. But as the iron door clanged shut and her screams burst through the chanting, the horrifying truth revealed itself. Faith was not going to save her. Nothing was. This was the world created by George Kimbangu, known to his followers as Papa Doc. A self-styled prophet whose influence has largely faded from public memory, yet whose cruelty and delusion left a trail of suffering during one of America's most overlooked cult movements. Little is known about his early life, and perhaps that mystery only fed the aura he built around himself. He arrived in California during the early 20th century, a time when mysticism, occultism, and fringe spiritual movements flourished on the edges of mainstream society. While other religious leaders spoke of enlightenment, Papa Doc promised something far more intoxicating: supernatural power, divine elevation, and a direct line to heavenly forces hidden from ordinary people. Those who crossed paths with him described a man who could be charming one moment and menacing the next, a figure who wrapped himself in prophecy, secrecy, and a growing sense of self-importance. The group he created, the Great 11, began as a spiritual sanctuary for people searching for meaning during a period of national uncertainty. But under Papa Doc's leadership, it quickly mutated into something far darker. He preached that true faith required proof, real sacrifice, real suffering, and unquestioning obedience. Members were instructed to starve themselves to purge worldly toxins, sometimes going days or weeks with barely anything to sustain them. He designed rituals meant to break down physical resistance and psychological independence, convincing his followers that pain was merely a sign that the divine was working within them. The miracle oven, his most notorious invention, became a symbol of absolute devotion, a test of spiritual purity that demanded a follower willingly step into a burning chamber, trusting their prophet more than their own senses. Several did, and several died. As the rituals escalated, so did the secrecy. Families searching for their missing loved ones were told nothing. Medical professionals were kept away. Papa Doc insisted that every tragedy was actually a spiritual victory, claiming that those who died had been taken by angels for their unwavering loyalty. The more destructive his demands became, the more his followers feared disobeying him, terrified that questioning the prophet would invite divine punishment. Their lives revolved around his visions, his rules, his unpredictable moods. In this environment of isolation and manipulation, even the most senseless act could be framed as holy. But eventually the outside world began to notice. Rumors of strange rituals and unexplained deaths reached local authorities, triggering quiet investigations that peeled back the layers of fear holding the Great 11 together. Former members who had escaped began to speak, describing starvation rituals that left bodies frail and gaunt, punishments disguised as spiritual purification, and the nightmarish oven tests that had claimed multiple lives. Some investigators reported finding makeshift grave sites, shallow pits that held the remains of followers whose deaths had been covered up in the name of religious devotion. Step by step, the truth became impossible to hide. What Papa Doc called prophecy, the law recognized as criminal negligence, and, in some cases, manslaughter. The collapse of the Great 11 was swift once its secrets were exposed. Followers fled, some out of fear of legal consequences, others because the spell had finally broken and they realized they had been taken in by a man whose prophetic authority had never existed in the first place. Survivors struggled for years to rebuild their lives, burdened by guilt, shame, and the psychological scars of a belief system that demanded everything from them and gave nothing in return. For the families of those who died, closure was elusive. The tragedy had unfolded in the shadows, and justice, if it came at all, felt painfully incomplete. Papa Doc's name may not be as widely known as Jim Jones or Marshall Applewhite, but his story stands as one of the earliest and most disturbing examples of a self-appointed prophet leading his followers straight into death. He crafted a world where loyalty was weaponized, faith was twisted, and obedience became a death sentence. And it all began with a man who convinced others that the path to salvation ran through the flames, literally. As the smoke from that failed miracle settles and the terrified survivors scatter into the night, one truth becomes painfully clear. Blind faith in the wrong hands can become a weapon more dangerous than any blade or bullet. And stories like this are just the beginning. Welcome to Savage Case Files, the channel where we dive deep into the darkest corners of belief, power, and manipulation. If you're drawn to true crime documentaries that expose how ordinary people get pulled into extraordinary danger, make sure you subscribe. We release investigations like this every day, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next case. Case 2, Annie Hamilton-Byrne. The story of Anne Hamilton-Byrne begins behind the walls of a secluded Australian compound, where mist-covered forests hid a world that looked peaceful from the outside, but operated under a strict, chilling doctrine inside. Picture the early morning quiet at Lake Eildon in the 1970s, the water still, the trees unmoving, while, inside a locked house, a group of children, dressed in matching clothes, recited prayers to a woman they believed was the female incarnation of Jesus Christ. For years, they lived in silence, in fear, and in absolute obedience to a leader who preached purity while inflicting torment. And any child who dared to disobey, even slightly, was told that God would punish them, that Anne would know their secrets, and that the outside world belonged to Satan. This was the world Anne Hamilton-Byrne created, and it would take decades before anyone understood the full horror of what she had done. Anne's rise began like many manipulative figures of her era, with charisma, mystique, and an unshakable confidence that convinced spiritually hungry adults she possessed a divine answer to every human fear. Born in 1921 and raised amid poverty and instability, Anne learned early how to reinvent herself. By the 1960s, she had crafted a persona of enlightened serenity, half guru, half mother, and fully untouchable in the eyes of her followers. Yoga students, doctors, psychiatrists, and wealthy professionals gravitated toward her teachings, which blended Eastern mysticism, Christian prophecy, and apocalyptic warnings. Anne claimed she had been chosen by God to prepare a new generation for an impending global collapse, and she insisted that only the children raised under her guidance would survive the catastrophe she predicted was coming. To fulfill this prophecy, Anne began collecting children, some adopted legally through corrupt connections, others acquired through falsified paperwork, and still others handed over by followers who believed surrendering their sons and daughters to Anne was the ultimate spiritual sacrifice. Inside the compound, she presented herself as a divine mother, but her theology revolved around control, fear, and punishment. The children she raised lived under a brutal regime, starvation used as discipline, forced sedation with psychiatric drugs, beatings justified as spiritual correction, and constant reminders that Anne alone determined their salvation. They were told the outside world was evil, that escape meant certain damnation, and that their only hope was complete obedience. At least one child died under these conditions, and survivors would later describe the environment as a nightmare masquerading as holiness. The truth began to unravel thanks to a handful of outsiders who refused to let rumors remain whispers. Former members, alarmed by Anne's increasing extremism, reached out to authorities. Reports of mistreatment trickled into social services, and slowly, investigators pieced together a picture of a cult operating under the radar, protected by professional allies and cloaked by Anne's reputation as a spiritual teacher. When police finally raided the Lake Eildon property in 1987, what they found stunned the nation. Frightened children with identical dyed blonde hair, scripted stories, and drug-dulled expressions. Hidden rooms, medical supplies, and a system built upon psychological domination. Interviews with the rescued children revealed years of indoctrination, abuse, and threats of divine punishment for even thinking of disobedience. Anne's fall was as dramatic as her rise. International warrants were issued. She fled to the United States, then to the UK, attempting to outrun the consequences of her empire of fear. Eventually arrested in 1993 after a global manhunt, she faced charges related to false adoptions and falsified documents. Although she avoided convictions for abuse due to legal limitations and the passage of time, her name became synonymous with manipulation, cruelty, and spiritual exploitation. The family fractured. Devoted adults who had once believed she was the reincarnation of Christ were forced to confront the devastation she left behind. And the children, now adults, continued to grapple with the trauma of a childhood shaped by fear disguised as salvation. In the aftermath, Australia was forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that a self-appointed prophet had built a secret world of torment right beneath its surface. The case prompted discussions about cult oversight, child welfare laws, and the dangerous power a charismatic leader can hold when cloaked in claims of divine authority. Survivors spoke out, documentaries were made, and the story of Anne Hamilton-Byrne became a permanent warning. When faith becomes fear and obedience becomes survival, the line between devotion and destruction disappears. Case 3. Roch Thériault. The nightmare of Roch Thériault's reign begins deep in the Canadian wilderness, where a scattered group of vulnerable young men and women huddled around a charismatic stranger who claimed to receive personal messages from God. In the late 1970s, Thériault, once an intelligent, talkative handyman with a flair for philosophy, reinvented himself as a prophetic savior promising protection from an imminent apocalypse. He lured his followers with a blend of charm and spiritual urgency, convincing them that only he could guide them through the destruction he insisted was just around the corner. But beneath his peaceful rhetoric, something darker brewed. As months passed, his commune became isolated, and Thériault's teachings shifted from inspiration to domination. He positioned himself as the absolute interpreter of divine will, demanding complete obedience and reshaping every detail of his followers' lives until they were entirely dependent on him. What began as a supposed sanctuary quickly morphed into a brutal dictatorship dressed in the language of faith. Thériault imposed grueling labor routines, sleep deprivation, and bizarre purification punishments designed to break the spirit of anyone who questioned him. He claimed his hands possessed miraculous healing power, but his version of healing was a twisted horror, conducting crude, agonizing surgeries on terrified followers without anesthesia, slicing and burning them in rituals he called divine interventions. One of the most horrifying episodes involved a young woman who was restrained while Thériault forcibly removed parts of her body under the guise of saving her soul. Some victims did not survive these procedures. Others died from untreated injuries, starvation, and sheer exhaustion, their deaths later justified by Thériault as the result of divine judgment rather than his own abuse. Inside the Anthill Kids, followers lived with constant dread, believing they would be punished by God if they dared to flee. That fear kept many silent, even as the violence escalated. Eventually, the outside world could no longer ignore the whispers of cruelty seeping out of the commune. A former follower escaped and contacted authorities, triggering an investigation that peeled back the layers of Thériault's seemingly peaceful spiritual community. Police uncovered survivors with horrifying injuries and testimonies so disturbing that investigators struggled to comprehend how such brutality had been hidden for so long. Witnesses described years of torture disguised as prophecy, and though some were terrified to speak, the truth poured out once they realized Thériault's power had finally been broken. In 1989, he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated assault and later murder, as survivors and prosecutors detailed the extent of his crimes. The courtroom heard stories of pain, manipulation, mutilation, and psychological domination that stunned the nation. Thériault was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, where he remained until his death in 2011, murdered by another inmate. The Anthill Kids disbanded, but the trauma they carried did not disappear. Many survivors struggled for decades to rebuild their lives, haunted by memories of the man they once believed was a messenger of God. The legacy of Roch Thériault stands as one of Canada's most chilling warnings about the deadly potential of unchecked religious authority. Proof that a single person, armed with charisma and the language of prophecy, can bend human lives into unthinkable darkness when fear becomes the foundation of faith. Case 4. Yahweh Ben Yahweh. The story of Yahweh Ben Yahweh begins in the charged atmosphere of 1980s Miami, where a charismatic preacher with flowing white robes and an air of quiet authority walked into struggling black neighborhoods and promised divine elevation, absolute protection, and a destiny chosen by God himself. To his followers, he wasn't just a pastor. He was the literal embodiment of the Heavenly Father, the only voice capable of interpreting scripture, history, and the hidden forces he claimed were conspiring against them. In those early days, his Nation of Yahweh movement felt like a sanctuary, a place where people who had been ignored or marginalized found belonging and purpose. But the sermons slowly shifted from empowerment to paranoia, and from unity to looming judgment. Yahweh Ben Yahweh warned that enemies lurked everywhere: former members, rival churches, journalists, critics, even innocent people on the street, insisting that God demanded purification. The fear was relentless. He preached that leaving the group meant forfeiting divine protection and opening oneself to cosmic punishment, earthly violence, or eternal destruction. What began as a spiritual community soon hardened into a militant inner circle, one that carried out brutal attacks under the guise of obedience and loyalty to their prophet. Police reports from the era documented a chilling pattern: dissidents disappearing, defectors murdered, and supposed infidels targeted to prove devotion. When investigators finally pieced together eyewitness testimonies, coded instructions, and the disturbing rituals performed by Yahweh's most devoted followers, the facade of a peaceful religious movement collapsed almost instantly. Federal agents moved in, uncovering a trail of terror orchestrated in the name of divine authority. Yahweh Ben Yahweh was arrested and ultimately convicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges linked to multiple killings, marking one of the most infamous takedowns of a self-proclaimed messiah in U.S. history. His empire, once sprawling and powerful, crumbled under the weight of violence, fear, and the betrayal of followers who had believed he could lead them to spiritual salvation. Instead, he led them to destruction, and the communities he touched still bear the scars of what he built and what it became. Case 5. Luc Jouret. The story of Luc Jouret begins not with violence, but with a soft-spoken charisma that made him appear more like a healer than a threat. By the early 1990s, his followers in Europe viewed him as a visionary who possessed secret cosmic wisdom, someone who could interpret the hidden laws of the universe and guide them toward a higher spiritual plane. Under dim candlelight and ritual music, Jouret promised that humanity was on the brink of catastrophic transformation, and only his chosen believers would escape the coming darkness. He spoke of purification, transcendence, and a spiritual transit that would carry their souls to a better world beyond the stars. In those early days, few could recognize that behind his calm demeanor was a man spiraling into radical delusion and apocalyptic obsession. But the turning point came when Jouret began merging New Age mysticism with increasingly extreme prophecies. He warned followers that the material world was corrupt, doomed, and spiritually poisoned. The only true salvation, he insisted, was to leave it behind before the final collapse. Members were instructed to detach from their families, surrender their wealth, and devote themselves entirely to the rituals of the order. What started as transcendental meditation sessions evolved into secret initiations, blood-tinged ceremonies, and increasingly militant rhetoric. Jouret preached that those who questioned him were tools of dark cosmic forces, and that any hesitation could jeopardize the entire group's destiny. His followers, already isolated from society, became trapped in a tightening psychological cage, where fear and obedience reinforced one another. The tragedy reached its horrifying climax in 1994, when a series of coordinated killings and ritual burnings shocked Europe. In Switzerland and Canada, authorities discovered remote chalets turned into death chambers, bodies arranged in ceremonial positions, many drugged, some shot, others burned in structures set on fire from within. Jouret and his co-leader, Joseph Di Mambro, had orchestrated what they called transits, a grotesque blend of murder and staged suicide intended to send their followers to a higher dimension. Survivors later testified that defectors were marked as traitors, and some victims were killed outright for refusing to participate. Over the next 3 years, additional deaths linked to the Solar Temple occurred in renewed waves, ultimately leaving more than 70 people dead. As investigators pieced together the devastation, the full scale of manipulation became clear. Financial exploitation, psychological coercion, manufactured prophecies, and a strict hierarchy had eroded followers' ability to resist. Jouret's image as a gentle spiritual teacher collapsed overnight, as newspapers across Europe branded him a mastermind of ritual slaughter and one of the most dangerous cult leaders of the century. Governments responded with urgent reviews of extremist sects, and the tragedy remains a reference point in discussions about destructive New Age movements. The Order of the Solar Temple disappeared into infamy, but the scars remained. Families shattered, nations horrified, and a chilling reminder of how easily spiritual yearning can be twisted into deadly obedience. Case 6. Credonia Mwerinde. The story of Credonia Mwerinde begins not with loud proclamations or stadium-style sermons, but with quiet whispers in rural Uganda. Whispers of a woman who claimed the Virgin Mary had appeared to her, chosen her, and entrusted her with visions of the end of the world. By the mid-1990s, those whispers had grown into a nationwide movement, drawing farmers, families, teachers, and entire communities into what seemed like a holy refuge from chaos. But behind the hymns, fasting, and disciplined order of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God lurked a darkness so deep that it would culminate in one of the deadliest cult massacres of the modern era. And at the center of it all stood Credonia Mwerinde, soft-spoken, intense, and utterly convinced that the apocalypse was coming. Credonia's rise began with a simple claim. She had seen the Virgin Mary standing before her in blinding light, warning that humanity's time was nearly over. To frightened villagers living through political upheaval and economic hardship, her message sounded like divine clarity. When she joined forces with former catechist Joseph Kibwetere, the movement took on an official structure: visions interpreted by Credonia, teachings delivered by Kibwetere, and commandments enforced with absolute authority. But in every meeting, every prophecy, every command, it was Credonia's voice that set the tone. Followers later recalled that she carried herself like someone who believed she was touched by heaven and expected unquestioning loyalty from everyone who followed her. As membership grew, so did the extremity of her demands. Credonia insisted that the end of the world would occur on a specific date, and that only those who submitted completely to the movement's teachings would survive God's final judgment. Everything took on apocalyptic urgency. She imposed harsh fasting rituals, eliminated all forms of pleasure, and required absolute obedience to even the smallest rules. Followers sold their property, surrendered their savings, abandoned their families, and moved into communal compounds to prepare for the final day. When people questioned her predictions or worried about the increasingly severe restrictions, Credonia warned that doubt was a sin that could cost them their salvation. Fear replaced logic, devotion replaced independence, and Credonia tightened her grip. When the first doomsday date passed with no apocalypse, Credonia did not lose followers. She gained even more control over them. She claimed that humanity's sinfulness had delayed God's wrath, and that the only solution was deeper sacrifice. Disobedience, she said, was an act of rebellion against heaven, and she began isolating anyone who questioned her authority. Starvation punishments grew harsher. Confessions became mandatory. Children and adults alike were told that questioning the movement meant burning in eternal fire. By the year 2000, hundreds of followers were living in a constant state of dread, terrified of the outside world, and even more terrified of disappointing the prophetess, who claimed to hold their eternal destiny in her hands. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Many followers had sold everything they owned and handed the proceeds to the movement. When they began asking where their money had gone and why the promised apocalypse still hadn't arrived, Credonia faced the one thing she could never tolerate: rebellion. In an astonishing and horrifying turn, the leadership announced a final apocalyptic celebration. Followers gathered at the Kimbangu compound for what they believed would be the moment God descended to take them to salvation. They prayed, sang hymns, and waited. Instead, doors were locked, windows were sealed, and a devastating explosion and fire engulfed the building, killing hundreds who had trusted Credonia with their lives. Investigators later discovered mass graves at additional compounds, revealing that many followers had been murdered before the final inferno. The death toll reached nearly 780. The largest cult massacre since Jonestown, and as the nation reeled in disbelief, one fact became clear: Credonia Mwerinde, the woman who had claimed divine visions, had vanished. To this day, she has never been found. Some believe she died in the inferno. Others believe she escaped and blended into rural life. But her legacy, one of manipulation, fear, and unimaginable devastation, remains a permanent scar in Uganda's history. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was not a refuge for the faithful. It was a trap built on fear, sustained by obedience, and controlled by a prophetess who wielded terror as her greatest weapon. Case 7. Marshall Applewhite. The camera now drifts forward in a slow, eerie glide, pulling the viewer into a quiet California mansion in March of 1997. A house where the curtains are drawn, the lights are low, and 39 identical bunk beds are neatly arranged in rows. On each bed lies a body, covered with a square purple shroud. Matching black shirts, black pants, brand new Nike Decades. This is the aftermath of one of the most infamous mass suicides in modern history, an event orchestrated by a man whose soft voice and trembling sincerity convinced his followers that death wasn't the end, but an upgrade. Marshall Applewhite, known within the group as Do or the Captain, he had spent years preparing his people for this moment, telling them that the human body was nothing but a temporary container, and that a spacecraft trailed behind the Hale-Bopp comet, waiting to take their purified souls to the next level. For many of his followers, the promise wasn't frightening. It was salvation, offered by the only person they believed understood the universe. Before Applewhite became the leader of Heaven's Gate, he was a former music teacher and son of a Presbyterian minister whose life had fallen apart piece by piece. Fired from academic positions, struggling with his identity, and burdened by a sense of cosmic importance he couldn't shake, he crossed paths with Bonnie Nettles in the 1970s, a nurse who shared his fascination with mysticism and prophecy. Together, they declared themselves divine messengers sent to guide humanity into a higher existence. Their message was strange but compelling. Earth was about to be recycled, and only those who detached completely from their human desires could ascend. With charisma and a strangely comforting gentleness, Applewhite drew in seekers who felt lost, rejected, or spiritually starved. To them, he wasn't a cult leader, he was the voice that finally made life make sense. But the story didn't end with spiritual teachings. Applewhite's doctrine slowly evolved into a system of absolute control. Members surrendered their identities, their families, their belongings, and even their names. They dressed alike, ate the same food, and lived under constant supervision. Doubt was treated as a dangerous weakness, a threat to the group's mission. Applewhite warned that the next level would reject anyone who clung to earthly attachments, convincing some to undergo voluntary castration as proof of their devotion. Underneath the calm surface was a belief system rooted in fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of spiritual failure, fear of disappointing the only leader they trusted. Every rule, every sacrifice, every test was framed as preparation for the great departure. In an astonishing turn, the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997 became the final trigger. Applewhite insisted that the brilliant light in the sky was the long-awaited sign, confirmation that the spacecraft carrying superior beings had arrived. The comet, he said, was the cosmic elevator they'd been preparing for all these years. He told his followers that the human world was doomed and that staying behind meant annihilation. The choice, as he framed it, wasn't suicide, it was escape. One former member later described how Applewhite's voice could make the most terrifying ideas sound almost gentle, like a father reassuring his children before a long trip. The truth unraveled only after authorities discovered the bodies, prompting investigators to sift through farewell videos, written testimonies, and the meticulously planned ritual that unfolded over 3 days. Each follower consumed a lethal mixture of barbiturates and vodka before lying down on their assigned bunk, and each was covered by another member, until the last group, who had no one left to cover them. Applewhite himself died among them, dressed in the same uniform, having convinced himself that his destiny, and theirs, lay far beyond the human world. In the aftermath, experts struggled to understand how a man so soft-spoken could lead dozens to their deaths, but survivors and defectors painted a chilling picture. Applewhite didn't rule through violence or rage. He ruled through the profound and devastating fear of missing the only path to eternal purpose. The legacy of Heaven's Gate became a global cautionary tale, a haunting reminder of how fragile the human search for meaning can be when placed in the hands of a leader who speaks softly but demands everything. And yet, the question that still lingers decades later is the one that terrifies people most. How could ordinary, intelligent adults come to believe that stepping into death was the only way to truly live? Case 8. Shoko Asahara. Shoko Asahara's rise began, not with fire and spectacle, but with a deceptively gentle image. A bearded, half-blind yoga teacher promising enlightenment to a generation of spiritually hungry young Japanese professionals. In the late 1980s, Tokyo was drowning in pressure, competition, and fear of failure, and Asahara exploited that desperation with frightening precision. His teachings blended Buddhism, Hindu iconography, apocalyptic Christianity, and his own fabricated visions of a world headed toward annihilation. To his followers, he wasn't just a teacher, he was a messiah who claimed he alone understood the cataclysm that was coming. Once they believed that, he slowly tightened the grip, telling them that compliance was salvation and disobedience meant cosmic destruction. What followed next revealed just how easily spiritual yearning could be twisted into lethal fanaticism. Asahara began framing the outside world as corrupted, toxic, and doomed to collapse under divine judgment. Inside Shinrikyo compounds, followers were deprived of sleep, separated from families, and conditioned to accept violence as purification. Dissenters were beaten or disappeared outright. Asahara's so-called healing sessions devolved into torture disguised as spiritual cleansing, where members were shocked with electricity, injected with drugs, or suffocated to induce rebirth experiences. Each act of brutality was justified as preparation for the apocalypse he insisted was just around the corner, an apocalypse he believed he was divinely appointed to trigger. But the story didn't end there. In an astonishing turn, Asahara's delusions escalated into a full-scale terrorist ambition. He became obsessed with acquiring chemical weapons, convincing his inner circle that mass casualties were necessary to fulfill prophecy. His followers built hidden laboratories, stockpiled chemicals, and tested nerve agents on animals, and on members who attempted to leave the group. By the early 1990s, several disappearances and unexplained deaths were already linked to Shinrikyo, but authorities struggled to penetrate the cult's labyrinthine structure. Every attempt to investigate was met with harassment, lawsuits, or outright threats, and Asahara portrayed each government inquiry as proof of a cosmic war being waged against God's chosen people. The tipping point came on the morning of March 20, 1995. Tokyo's subway system, one of the busiest in the world, became the stage for one of the most shocking domestic terror attacks in modern history. Operatives boarded multiple trains during rush hour and punctured packets of liquid sarin, releasing a silent, invisible nerve agent into crowded carriages. Commuters collapsed on the floors, gasping, convulsing, clutching their eyes as blindness spread through packed tunnels. 13 people died. Over 6,000 were injured. Panic rippled through the city, and for the first time the world saw the full extent of Asahara's apocalyptic obsession. The investigation that followed was swift and overwhelming. Police stormed compounds, uncovering chemical labs, weapons stockpiles, and rooms designed for torture and confinement. Former members came forward with testimonies of killings ordered directly by Asahara, including executions of traitors, forced confinement, and chemical experiments carried out in the name of spiritual purity. The facade of enlightenment collapsed, revealing a prophet who had weaponized faith to justify murder. Shoko Asahara was arrested, tried, and ultimately sentenced to death. His execution, along with the executions of several senior cult members, finally closed the chapter on one of the most terrifying cults of the modern era. But the consequences lingered far beyond the courtroom. Trauma etched into survivors' lives. National laws rewritten to prevent extremist religious groups from gaining such power again. And a haunting reminder of how quickly a message of salvation can be twisted into a doctrine of death when placed in the hands of a manipulative, fear-driven prophet. Case 9. David Koresh. The story of David Koresh begins long before flames engulfed the Mount Carmel compound in 1993. It starts with a soft-spoken young man named Vernon Howell, a high school dropout with a troubled childhood, a desperate need for validation, and an extraordinary talent for convincing people that he alone could interpret the deepest secrets of Scripture. By the time he reinvented himself as David Koresh, he had transformed that need into a claim of divine appointment, telling followers he was the final messianic leader, chosen to unlock the book of Revelation. Inside the Branch Davidian community, his quiet charisma hardened into absolute authority, and soon every rule, every prophecy, every punishment flowed directly from him. Under his leadership, fear became the invisible fence encircling the compound. Koresh preached that the outside world was controlled by demonic forces determined to destroy God's chosen remnant. Leaving Mount Carmel, he warned, meant stepping into the hands of Satan himself. He claimed that doubting him, even silently, invited spiritual ruin. Followers were told their eternal destiny depended on absolute obedience to his teachings. Families were reorganized according to his revelations. Marriages were dissolved at his command. Children reassigned and women spiritually married to him under the justification of a divine mandate. The fear of divine punishment, paired with the fear of earthly annihilation, locked people into a psychological prison from which escape felt impossible. But Koresh's apocalyptic warnings didn't end with sermons. He insisted that a final, violent confrontation with the government was coming, a showdown he framed as a sacred test of loyalty. Weapons stockpiled inside the compound weren't seen as tools of aggression, but as instruments of holy defense. The more paranoid his prophecies became, the more tightly followers clung to him, terrified of what God might do if they wavered. Yet, in an astonishing turn, the confrontation Koresh had long predicted arrived not through prophecy, but through a federal investigation into alleged weapons violations and abuse within the compound. When ATF agents attempted to serve a search warrant on February 28, 1993, gunfire erupted almost immediately. To this day, who fired first remains a point of controversy, but the deadly standoff that followed became one of the most infamous sieges in American history. Inside Mount Carmel, Koresh framed the conflict as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, declaring the unfolding violence proof that God's chosen were under attack. For 51 tense days, negotiators pleaded for a peaceful resolution, but Koresh stalled with endless scriptural monologues, insisting he needed time to receive further revelations. As negotiations dragged on, fear and control tightened within the compound. Followers believed stepping outside meant not only death but eternal damnation. The end came on April 19, when tanks rolled forward and tear gas was deployed in an attempt to force a surrender. Instead, chaos exploded. Fires erupted inside the compound. Investigators later concluded they were deliberately set, and within minutes the entire structure became an inferno. 76 Branch Davidians died, including children, trapped in a nightmare Koresh had spent years convincing them was holy destiny. In the aftermath, the world grappled with the scale of the tragedy. Congressional hearings, documentaries, and decades of analysis followed, all trying to understand how one man's prophetic claims could shape a community so completely that they followed him into destruction. Koresh's legacy remains a devastating example of how fear-based authority, when fused with religious absolutism, can override logic, conscience, and even the basic instinct to survive. His followers weren't simply misled, they were conditioned to believe that disobedience to him meant disobedience to God, and that dying with him was safer than living without him. And in the end, that belief cost them everything. Case 10. Jim Jones. By the late 1970s, the compound at Jonestown, deep in the Guyanese jungle, had grown eerily still at night. Quiet in a way that made even loyal followers uneasy. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Loudspeakers carried Jim Jones's rambling sermons into the darkness, and the once hopeful paradise he promised had hardened into something far more frightening. Followers later recalled how his voice echoed through the trees like a prison warden's announcement, warning them of traitors, infiltrators, and impending apocalypse. Here, thousands of miles from their American homes, ordinary families found themselves trapped under the control of a man they had once revered as a visionary prophet, unaware that the story of the People's Temple was racing toward one of the darkest endings in modern religious history. Jim Jones had not always been the menacing figure who presided over the doomed settlement. In the 1950s and 60s, he built a powerful reputation as a civil rights advocate and charismatic preacher who drew crowds with his fiery commitment to equality. Many early followers described him as compassionate, brilliant, and unshakably confident, someone who made them feel seen in a world that often ignored them. But behind the stage lights and humanitarian image grew a man increasingly addicted to power. By the time he relocated his church to California, Jones's sermons mixed promises of utopia with paranoid warnings of conspiracies lurking around every corner. He claimed God spoke through him alone, that he could see the hidden motives of every follower, and that anyone who doubted him risked divine punishment. Or worse. Those fear tactics grew sharper as the movement expanded. Members who questioned his authority were publicly shamed, isolated, or threatened with supernatural consequences. Families were separated, marriages were broken, and loyalty to Jones was demanded above all else. Eventually, the pressure mounted so intensely that he declared the outside world too dangerous, accusing the U.S. government of plotting to destroy the People's Temple. His followers, conditioned to believe his every warning, uprooted their lives and followed him into the remote jungle to build what he called the Promised Land. But instead of peace, they found armed security, forced labor, surveillance, rehearsed suicide drills called White Nights, and a prophet whose paranoia was now ruling every second of their lives. When reports of abuse reached the United States, Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown in November 1978 to investigate. What happened next exposed the full extent of Jones's desperation. After a chaotic, emotional visit, several members begged Ryan to take them back home. Jones saw this as treason, shouting to his inner circle that he was being betrayed. As Ryan and the defectors headed to a nearby airstrip, Jones ordered a hit squad to intercept them. In a burst of gunfire, the congressman and 4 others were murdered. It was the moment Jones had been waiting for. The proof, he claimed, that enemies were finally coming to destroy them. Back at the compound, he gathered nearly 1,000 followers under the pavilion and delivered his final sermon, a chilling monologue urging them to choose revolutionary suicide over humiliation. Parents were forced to bring forward their children as vats of cyanide-laced punch were prepared. Survivors recalled the screams, the chaos, and the crushing pressure as Jones insisted that dying together was the only path to salvation. Guards stood watch, ensuring no one ran. Moments later, the mass poisoning began. In the span of a single afternoon, 909 people, many of them children, lost their lives. Jones himself was later found dead from a gunshot wound, ending the reign of a man who once promised liberation but delivered only tragedy. The aftermath of Jonestown shook the world. Images of hundreds of bodies lying face down in the grass flashed across global news, forcing governments, religious organizations, and psychologists to confront the terrifying power of coercive control. The term cult entered everyday vocabulary. Families who lost loved ones spent decades grappling with grief and confusion, and even today, Jonestown stands as one of the most devastating examples of what happens when charisma, fear, and unchecked authority collide. It remains the deadliest mass murder-suicide in modern history and the most haunting legacy ever left by a self-proclaimed prophet. As the dust settles on these 10 devastating stories, it becomes painfully clear that the most dangerous prophets are rarely the loudest. They're the ones who speak softly while demanding absolute obedience. From isolated compounds in the jungles of Guyana to candlelit basements in suburban America, from apocalyptic visions whispered by self-declared messiahs to doctrines twisted into weapons of control, each of these leaders turned faith into a tool of domination, fear, and death. What unites their stories isn't just the destruction they caused, but the terrifying ease with which ordinary people searching for purpose, healing, or hope, were pulled into their orbit and pushed toward unthinkable ends. Their followers didn't join to die. They joined believing they were stepping closer to salvation. Instead, they stepped into shadows they could never escape. These tragedies remind us that unchecked authority, when wrapped in divine language, can lead to horrors far beyond the imagination. And history shows us one final chilling truth. Prophets like these don't disappear. They reemerge in new forms, in new eras, preying on new fears. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these cases shocked you the most, and what do you think drives people to follow leaders like this, even when the warning signs are everywhere? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.